Good morning, everyone. What a great joy to be here this morning with all of you. I'm so grateful to Franciscan University of Steubenville Life Team, all of those who have organized this conference, the youth ministers and adults from the parishes who are here, and especially all of our young people who have gathered to be a part of this wonderful event. I don't know whether some of you have seen, there's a film in the theaters now called Far from the Madding Crowd. It's based on a very famous novel by Thomas Harding. The protagonist of the novel is a young woman named Bathsheba Everty. And she eventually marries the finest shepherd in the county, a man by the name of Gabriel Oak. One of the most poignant scenes in the movie takes place when Gabriel, who by great sacrifice and hard work has been able to lease a farm and acquire a huge flock of sheep. But one night while he's asleep, his sheepdog, a new sheepdog, an experienced sheepdog, goes out, gathers the flock, runs them up a hill, and all of the sheep rush across this plain and fall off of a precipice onto the rocks and into the sea. It's a very tragic scene. It reminds us of what happens when the sheep do not have a shepherd. Today's readings are talking to us about good leaders, good shepherds, and bad leaders. In the first reading, Jeremiah rails against the bad leaders, the selfish rulers who don't care about the people. And God promises that he will send good leaders, good shepherds. Steubenville East shows us how God keeps his promises, preparing good leaders in his church. The gospel shows us Jesus preparing the very first leaders in the church, the apostles. Last Sunday, as you remember, the gospel is taken from this same chapter, chapter 6 in Mark, and it shows Jesus sending out the apostles 2 by 2 in their first field and assignment. Jesus sends these new leaders in training out because discipleship is never a solo flight. He sends them 2 by 2. We learn to be disciples the way that we learn a language, by being part of a community that speaks that language. And so Jesus sending his disciples out 2 by 2 is very significant. It's so that they can support each other, but also so that they can model to the world what discipleship is about, being part of a community, so that they can show the world how disciples love each other, forgive each other, correct each other, encourage each other, care for each other. The Jesus and me paradigm is false. Jesus and us is the church. When the Lord teaches the apostles to pray, he says, pray our Father, not my Father. Because being a child of God means being a brother and sister to the other disciples. Today's gospel is a continuation of that Nazareth East that Jesus had organized. He sent the apostles out and told them not to worry about material resources, food or money or clothing. He wanted them to depend on God's loving providence and to trust in God's care for them. Between last Sunday's gospel and today's gospel, the sending of the apostles on their first tried evangelization, and today when they return to Jesus to give a full report of their adventures. That same chapter in Mark's Gospel tells us about the martyrdom of John the Baptist. As John the Baptist's ministry ends, the ministry of the apostles begins. John's death is a shocking episode in the Gospel. And it all happens at a party, a birthday party for a bad shepherd, a bad leader, King Herod, who had married his brother's wife, who was also his niece, a really dysfunctional family. It's like those parties where there's too much drinking, casual sex, drugs, and a lot of bad decisions that lead to tragic circumstances. There was some sort of striptease, a lap dance that got the party goers cheering, and the next thing you know, King Herod, who was undoubtedly wasted himself, says to the young dancer that he would give her whatever she wanted. She went to her mother, Herodias, who said, "Ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter." Herod knew that that was crazy. He didn't want to do it. But he felt the peer pressure of all of those drunken partygoers, and so he said yes. And like the ISIS terrorists, they cut off the head of John the Baptist. John was Jesus' cousin, his friend, his disciple, and now he was dead because of a stupid party. The moral of the story is, I guess, don't go to stupid parties. St. Mark, I believe, includes this very gruesome episode just before today's gospel about the apostles coming back from their missionary experience, because Mark wants to show us the seriousness of the situation, that being a disciple of Jesus is at times dangerous. There will be opposition. Some people will react very negatively to the announcement of the gospel. It's a costly grace of discipleship. Having said that, I'm sure that these apostles, returning from their first assignment, were very excited and anxious to share with Jesus everything that happened to them, the joys, the scary moments, the tedious experiences, their successes and their failures. When Mitt Romney was running for president, the Boston Globe did a story about his early life, which I found very interesting. And there they described how Mitt Romney had been a Mormon missionary in France, going door to door trying to make converts. When Mitt Romney explained to the French people that part of being a Mormon would be to give up wine, coffee, cigarettes, and Coca-Cola, he didn't make any converts. I remember thinking to myself, maybe Mitt Romney didn't make any converts, but his missionary experience was not a failure, because it certainly deepened his own faith so much. The apostles' faith was certainly deepened by this initial experience of announcing the gospel. The way we make our faith stronger is by sharing it with others. When the apostles get back from their missionary experience, they reported to Jesus all that they had done and all that they had taught. Part of their activities were works of mercy, caring for the sick and the needy. At the same time, they were teaching people about Jesus, his words and his deeds, and the way of life that he has come to impart to us. Jesus is delighted by their enthusiasm, but he says to them, "Come away by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while." Mark says that so many people were coming to talk to the apostles that they didn't even have time to eat. Whenever I hear this story, I remember the story from the life of St. Francis about a certain conversation he had with one of his earliest followers, Brother Leo. Francis asked Leo, he said, "Brother Leo, what was the special way in your life that allowed you to discover God?" And Brother Leo didn't want to answer, but St. Francis kept on insisting. And finally, Brother Leo said, "Well, if you have to know, by the grace of God, I was born lazy. And because I was lazy, I discovered God in my life." Francis said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, my brothers and sisters were all very industrious, and they went out and made a lot of money and big names for themselves. But I used to like to go out in the fields and look at the animals and the flowers, and at night I'd go up to the roof of my father's house and look at the stars and the planets, and I'd ask myself, where does all this beauty come from?" And eventually, it led me to discover God in my life. And so I say that my being lazy allowed me to discover God in my life. The moral of the story, of course, isn't that sloth will help us to become spiritual or close to God, but we need to have time and space for God in our lives if we are going to discover His presence, if we're going to discover how much He loves us. In today's gospel, Jesus is reminding His disciples that we all need moments of rest. We need moments of Sabbath. Jesus tells us that He is the Lord of the Sabbath and that the Sabbath is for us. It's time and space for God in our lives. One of the great treasures that the Jewish people have is the Sabbath. When I was bishop in the West Indies, I was invited to visit the synagogue on the island where I lived. It was the oldest synagogue in the Western Hemisphere, an old Danish West Indian building with sand on the floor. As I walked around that old synagogue, I picked up this old Jewish prayer book, and it just happened to open to a prayer that began with the words, "More than Israel has kept the Sabbath, the Sabbath has kept Israel." And I thought to myself, wow, what a great truth that is. We of the New Covenant can say exactly the same thing. More than we have kept the Sunday Mass obligation, it has kept us a people. It has kept us focused on God. The Sunday Eucharist is the center of our lives. It's impossible to be a disciple, to be a missionary disciple, without accepting Jesus' invitation to come away and rest in the Lord, to experience Sabbath, time and space for God in our lives. And for us, the Eucharist is the center of that Sabbath, the center both as individuals and as a community. Sadly, some Catholics are very casual about their approach to the Sunday Eucharist. They come when it's convenient, oftentimes looking to be entertained rather than to worship, praise, and thank God for all the blessings of our lives. Following the passage in today's Gospel, in chapter 6 of Mark, comes the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves, one of Jesus' greatest miracles that was to prepare the disciples for the gift of the Eucharist. So today's Gospel is actually sandwiched in between two banquet stories. The banquet of the bad shepherd, Herod, and the banquet of the good shepherd, Jesus, who feeds the multitude in the desert. This is all part of chapter 6 in Mark's Gospel. Which banquet do we want to be a part of? Herod's or Jesus? As Jesus' family, the Sunday Eucharist is where we gather as brothers and sisters to be nourished by the Word of God and fed by the bread of life, so that we have the spiritual strength to go forth on our mission of carrying the good news to the world. Learn about the Eucharist. Learn its significance. Learn the prayers and the hymns. Learn to listen to the Scriptures and to the homily. The Good Shepherd is feeding the flock at the Eucharist. To be absent is to risk spiritual anorexia. The Gospel today describes for us the rhythm of Christian life. To alternate between the meeting with God in a secret place and serving people in the marketplace, or as Pope Francis says, in the field hospital. When Jesus and the apostles arrived at their destination, a huge crowd had already gathered. They ran on foot to get there before Peter's boat could cross the lake. Mark said that when Jesus disembarked, he saw this vast crowd, and his heart was moved to compassion, for they were like sheep without a shepherd. I'm always moved when the Gospels mention Jesus' heart. As Catholics, we have a devotion to the heart of Jesus. His heart is a symbol of his love, of his capacity for friendship, for his desire to be close to us, to forgive us, to care for us. Our task is to show that love to the world, to help the most unlovable to know that Jesus comes to love them. Our love for people should express itself in our desire to share with them the joy of the gospel. You must be the good leaders that lead people to the heart of Jesus, to meaning in life, to forgiveness, to salvation. It's a huge task, but we can do it together. But we must make time and space for God. We must have Sabbath. We must have prayer in our lives, so that we will truly be on fire with the mission of building a civilization of love and mercy, for working together to safeguard the gifts that God has given us, even creation. The Gospel often contrasts the crowd and the community, the madding crowd and the community, we might say. That madding crowd is a collection of individuals who are pursuing their own personal interests to the detriment or the neglect of others. But Jesus is calling us not to be a crowd, but to be a community where we treat each other as brothers and sisters. Our task is to convert the crowd into a community, a family of believers. In the Gospels, we see so many examples of where the crowd is pushing people away from Christ. When Bartimaeus, the beggar, calls out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me," the people said, "Shut up." But Jesus calls him over and cures him. When Zacchaeus, the tax collector, who was vertically challenged, wanted to see Jesus, it was the crowd was pushing him away, so he had to climb the tree. My favorite story in the Gospels when I was a child was the story of those men who carried their friend who was a paralytic they carried him on some sort of a cot, and when they got to the house where Peter's house where Jesus was preaching, the crowd wouldn't let them in. So they went up to the roof, opened up a hole in the roof, and lowered their friend down in ropes and put him right in front of Jesus. And I thought to myself, wow, I'd like to have friends like that. But I'd like to be a friend like that too. That's what discipleship is about. It's about turning the crowd into a community. Not pushing people away from the Lord, but drawing them closer. And the Good Shepherd is counting on you to be good leaders, to be missionary disciples, on fire with love, filled with a sense of mission to be carrying the joy of the gospel to a broken world. Thank you very much for being here in this deserted place, preparing yourself for the great mission that Jesus has entrusted to each of you and to all of us as his community, as his people. God bless you.